Byron Lyles, Jane Ho, and Don Trew. Now these people are from a pioneer family. Their families have been here for generations, and they're going to tell us how life was starting about the 30s. Yeah, okay, it's all yours.
I didn't know I was going to be on so early. I was still eating. But anyway, my name is Don Trew, and I came to Bonita Springs in 1936, and it was a very small community at that time. But anyway, first of all, I want to tell you the method in which I came here, and the stories that I've told it before. But my father was a cabin boy on one of J.P. Morgan's yachts, and he sailed around the coast of Florida, and they tied up to a dead tree on Miami Beach. And after that, he said Miami Beach at that time was nothing on there but that one tree limb that they tied up to. There was nothing there. And so then they came around into the Gulf of Mexico, and they anchored up offshore of Big Hickory Pass. And they came ashore, came up the river, the Imperial River, with a dinghy and searched for fresh vegetables and fresh water. Well, my father found this place called Survey, and it was really a wild place. And the biggest bunch of people that were here were just government surveyors, and there was very few people living here at that time. So he fell in love with the place, and he made a vow to himself someday he would come back. And in 1936, they sold the farm in upper state New York, and I was 6 years old, and they came to Florida. Well, my father, being a finished carpenter and a good engineer and a builder, he built a trailer that resembled a prairie schooner. And it looked like a prairie schooner, canvas top and white and everything. When you put it behind the car, why, it resembled a prairie schooner, you know. So he loaded up in a Chandler. He bought a Chandler, and he loaded up 5 kids in the prairie schooner, and we came to Florida, and that's how I got here. And I attended my first year of elementary school here in Bonita Springs, over on Dean Street. My first year of school here. And I don't know what the census was at that time, but it was like there couldn't have been more than 200, 250 people lived in the whole area. And I think there were 5 telephones in town, and it was really a quaint place to live. There was a very sensitive area, not too many people. You could go fishing and catch a fish. What you needed to eat, you could go a mile to the east, go hunting in the glades, but that's all gone because now other people found out about this paradise and they all want to come here. But years ago, when we went to school in Fort Myers, why, if you lived in Bonita Springs, it was like it would really hurt for them to say it, you know, because it was like it hurt their face to say Bonita Springs. But now you can't keep them out. So, you know, it was a paradise, and now it's a lot of people enjoying it the same as we did. But we also had a lot of cattle ranchers around, and I was trying to think today, we on Sunday, why the cattle ranchers, they would bring their cattle right through the middle of Bonita Springs, and they would take them south to what we called a dipping vat, and they had to dip all these cattle, and they'd run them through this dipping vat. And the reason for this, back in those days, there was a worm or a fly that would get on an open sore on a cow or an animal, and they would stay there, and they would eat the flesh and eventually kill the critter, whatever it may be. And the ranchers were extremely affected with it because if a cow had a calf and there was blood on the wound, then the worms would get there and they would continue until they killed the cow, you know. So these farmers would, or ranchers would bring their cattle right through Bonita under the canopy of Lawhorn's grocery store and under the canopy of Benson's, and here they came, the herd of cattle on Sundays, you know. And then they get them all dipped, and then you got to bring them back. So it was quite an experience as a boy, you know, watching these farmers, these cattlemen, you know, bringing their cattle through town, you know. But the University of Florida at Gainesville came to our rescue. They developed or produced a screwworm fly that was sterile, and they exterminated these screwworm flies by the sterile flies that they just eventually died out because they had no way of reproducing. So it was really an experience that to witness that, you know, back when I was growing up. But Bonita Springs has went through a lot of changes since then, and I would like to say that the reason that Bonita Springs is here is because of the Imperial River. And the Imperial River was the main source of transportation, and all of our freight came in by boat until the railroads came through, and the mail came in by boat. We have one house left that I know of that came in by boat, came up the river, and that's the Lightner house, and it's an Aladdin home, and it came up the river on a river boat and assembled over on Lightner's place. But the Wayside Inn was also came up the river on a river boat, and it was I believe it was the Royal Palm Hotel in Fort Myers, and it was disassembled and put on a boat and brought to Bonita Springs up the river and then constructed over there, you know. So the Imperial River plays a big part in why we're all here. And the river at one time was called Snake River or Snake Creek because it's so crooked. And at the end of the Imperial River, or the Snake Creek, there was a place called the Orga Hole, and it was just like a corkscrew. And I often think about how these boat captains brought boats through the Orga Hole, because I know growing up as a boy and bringing a boat through there was quite a treacherous thing because the tide was run so hard through the Orga Hole, you know. But they did it. And in 1912, between 1912 and 1913, they changed the name from Survey to Bonita Springs. And there's several different theories why it changed, but I think the main reason it was because the developers came in just before the Great Depression, and they developed land here. Bonita Springs had street lights, and it had sidewalks, and a lot of people, even the natives that live here, don't know it, but we actually had our own power plant at one time. And they would run the power plant until 10 o'clock at night, and then we shut it off. Because there's no need to have power when everybody was asleep, you know. And we actually had street lights too. There were a few street lights in town. But after that, during the Great Depression and everything settled down, and developers didn't sell land like they wanted to, and we were incorporated at that time, but there was very little money coming in and nobody paid their taxes, so the city went broke. And we had Florida Power and Light, I understand, shut off our power because we couldn't pay for the power bill for the street lights. So that's another story. But so they changed the name of the town to Bonita Springs, and it's my honest belief that it was named Bonita Springs because of one of the developers' daughter was named Bonita or whatever, and so that's how they got the name Bonita Springs. And the way the springs come in is that the Shangri-La, there is a spring, and for many years it flowed into Oak Creek, and it put out a lot of water into Oak Creek, and it was beautiful. And the Imperial River used to have a lot of springs in it. You could take a boat trip up the river, and these springs would be bubbling out of the ground, and that's part of the name for Bonita Springs. That's how it's got its name, you know. So between 1912 and 1913, it changed from Bonita Springs, from Survey to Bonita Springs, and these realtors felt that how could they sell a piece of land in a godforsaken place eaten up with mosquitoes and snakes and alligators with a name like Survey. So they changed it to Bonita Springs. And so that was my understanding of why it was called, you know, Bonita Springs. So since then we went through many, many changes, and I guess it was probably in 1960 things started picking up, but some people say that the reason that we have the population that we have now is because we do have excellent city water, and before everybody depended on an artesian well, you know. So they say that that's probably one reason, but whether it is or not, who knows. But get back to the old days in Bonita Springs. Most people had either a cistern to collect rainwater off of the roof, or they had a water tower, a wooden water tower in their backyard, and they would pump the water out of a well into the water tower, and that was your water pressure for the inside of the home. So there was a lot of old-fashioned waterfalls, tanks. And some of them in town, we had wells that would flow with pressure, and we had what we call a water ram, and this water ram with the pressure from underground would pump the water up into the tank. When the tank would get full, well, you'd shut it off, and then you would have water pressure in the house, and it was a very efficient way to go, you know, because you didn't have city water, you know. But anyway, I could probably go on, but I don't want to steal the whole show, and I'd like to give our...
You were going to say something about the shell factory.
Oh, she said I should say something about the shell factory. It was in 1930, probably 37 or 38, Harold Krant and Ann England came to Bonita Springs, and they started a novelty seashell manufacturing plant. And they would get people to gather the shells off of the beaches, out of the bays, and they imported a lot of shells from the Bahama Islands, and they made shell lamps and shell jewelry and all kinds of things out of seashells. And the shell factory was one of the, back in those days, was the main thing that people could work at and make money. And they also upstairs over the shell factory, there was like 5, 6 apartments. And I was fortunate enough to live in one of them at one time, in one of the shell factory apartments. And which was good, because when I first came here, a place to rent a house was almost impossible. If there was a house, somebody was living in it. And there was no rental properties around. And at one time we lived right here on the grounds in a tent because we no place to live. So we had a tent, and we had the facilities here of the hotel. But the shell factory, in I believe it was 1952, in the middle of the night, mysteriously burned, and they moved to North Fort Myers. But it was one of the main things that people could work at here, and people could work in their homes. They would job out parts of lamps. They would take a big roll of wire and the plugs that go on the end and the sockets, and they would do this construction at home and then bring it into the shell factory. It was like piecework, you know. So a lot of that went on in the community from the shell factory.
I remember the shell factory.
Yeah, I remember that.
Don, didn't you also live in Bonita Bay?
Yes, I did. My father was a fish house tenant on Bonita Bay and on Estero Bay, and the fish house was owned by Ed Henry, and he had a market here in Bonita, and he needed somebody down there to buy the fish from the fishermen when they would bring them in. And they had an ice house, and he would take the fish off the fishermen and weigh them up and then give them a ticket. And then when they sold the fish, why Ed Henry would give them their money, you know. But there was an old house down there, and we lived in that old house on right on Bonita Bay, which is, or Estero Bay, which is in Bonita Bay, right on the bay. And it was quite an experience. There was no electricity, no running water, and very little screens on the windows, and with the mosquitoes and the sandflies and the other varmints, well, we survived. But it was quite an experience to live like in the wilderness, really, you know. So, yeah, yes, I did. I lived in down there.
Well, you somewhat answered it, Don, but I was wondering where your primary home was. I don't recall where you lived.
I've never had one.
No permanent dwelling.
No. My mother and my stepfather built a house on Tennessee Street. But in the meantime, I had many homes. I'm not complaining, but I did come from a broken home, and I had several families that would allow me to live in with them because they had children of my age, and I never had a real home of my very own after we came to Florida, you know. I'd like to tell you a little story about this hotel. My mother-in-law, which I don't like that word, my wife's mother, I should say, was the station master for the railroad when it came through Bonita Springs. Well, she was the station master, and she used to meet the train, take the mail from Bonita Springs, take it to Naples, wait till the train came back and bring the Naples mail back this way. And when she went down there, she would go fishing on the Naples Pier and for a couple hours, and then she would ride the train back. But anyway, this hotel was constructed then. It wasn't near as elaborate as it is today, but it was for sale. And Mrs. Parrish, she bought it for $2,000. And her husband, Haywood Parrish, he worked for the railroad, and he was a dispatcher, a telegraph operator, and he dispatched all the materials coming through to build the Tamiami Trail from Tampa to Miami. He was the dispatcher. So she came home and she says, "Haiti, you won't believe what I just did." He said, "What is that, Ruth?" She says, "I just bought that hotel." He says, "Woman, you must be out of your mind. Who would want to buy a hotel in a godforsaken place like this, infested with mosquitoes and flies?" And she says, "You just go right back and see if they'll give you your money back." And so she went back, and they gave her money back. So that was her short ownership of a hotel. But it's really been an experience for me to live here and grow up here. I went in 1948 or 47. They discovered shrimp off the coast of Florida, off in the Florida Straits and around Key West. And being an adventurous person, I hired on a shrimp boat to go catch shrimp. And I did that for a couple of years, and then I worked here and made several trips to Mexico on a shrimp boat. Then we went to the East Coast, and I had a letter from Uncle Sam, and he said I should report. And so I came home and I reported, and I was inducted into the Marine Corps in 1951. And after that, I came home, and I was in 2 years, and I came home and I was on the job. So I thought to myself, I need to do something that's stable, something that I can depend on, because I had already experienced commercial fishing, and it was a hit and miss deal, and I really didn't like that. So I went to work for the Florida Power and Light Company. I worked there 36 years, retired, and since then I've been retired almost 20 years now. And I've been enjoying every bit of it, and I work with the Historical Society when I can and try to get things done. And it's really been a pleasure working with the Historical Society, and I love Bonita Springs, and I wouldn't trade it for. I've traveled in every state of the Union, and I never would leave Bonita Springs. Does anybody have any questions? Yes.
I came here late. Can I ask your name?
My name is Don Trew. Spell the last name T-R-E-W. Okay?
False, false.
Donald Duck, if you must know.
Okay.
On one of the murals, it shows the steamboat to Edison coming up the Imperial River. How
Yes.
far did it actually come up? Where it was navigable?
All the way up to Bonita Grande Boulevard, up that far.
That far?
Yeah.
How did it turn around? It didn't look that wide.
Yeah, but it's deep. See, the Imperial River is it's like a canyon. There's a lot of limestone here, and it's the rocks on both sides of it keep it in its place, and it's navigable way on up. There's a place up about Dean Street on Imperial Parkway that orange groves all the way around it, and that was called that spot was called the boat landing, and the river boats used to go all the way up there and load fruit on the boats. And while I got your attention, I want to tell you a little story. The river boats used to come in and bring stuff from Sears and Roebuck and various places, whatever freight came in, and then they would get boatloads of fruit and take it back out. Well, down here in the river, at the Nutting Like It property was then, and these river boats used to tie up along the bank waiting for a load of fruit underneath the oak trees. Well, they would stay there, they would congregate, from one boat to the other, like men would, and this one boat caught a fire, and so to keep the other boats from burning, they untied it and they pushed it across the river, and it burned, and it sunk right there. So I asked my father-in-law, I said, well, what caused this fire? He says, well, they were making moonshine, they were making white lightning on the boat, and it blew up and set the boat afire. So they shoved it across the river so it would protect the other boats. Well, in 1960, about that time, or whenever my children played in the river, which that was our playground, we played in the river all the time, but my children were swimming at this place where this boat burned, and they saw this wagon wheels sticking out of the sand, and the river was blowing pretty fast, and they kept digging around it, and they thought that they had found a cannon. So here they come running home. We got to get this thing out of the river, Dad. Man, I said, well, what are we going to do? So we had to try to get this cannon out of the river. So the kids, they dug around it and dug around it. And so a friend of mine had a little drag line crane. And I said to Harry Braxton, I said, Harry, you got to give me a hand. These kids won't leave me alone till we get this thing out of the river. So we took the timber down there and stuck it between the spokes, put a chain on it, and the drag line tugged and pulled, and then finally it came loose, and it was still anchored to the boat that sunk. It had big long lag screws that fastened it to the timbers. So when it came up and we swung it around and put it on the shore, it was the engine out of that boat, and it was a one-lung engine, barrel about this big around with big wheels on it, balance wheels. And so that was the cannon that we got out of the river. Well, I kept it took it home, and it sat in my yard for a couple, 2 or 3 years. And the kids, all the neighborhood kids would come over and they'd play on it. Well, when you take metal out of the water, you know what happens. It starts to deteriorate, it starts to rust. And all these kids had rust on their clothes. My wife said, you got to get rid of that thing. So I called the museum in Fort Myers, Lee County. Nobody wanted it. So my wife said, what are you going to do with it? I said, well, I got a backhoe, and I dug a big hole, and I buried it. And it's still on my property. And other than, I'll be quiet now and let my colleagues, they have some stories to tell you, I'm sure.
And if you'll take